The train cut through the endless sweep of the Canadian shield, its wheels clattering against the frozen rails as if beating out a warning to the men inside the wooden boxcars. Dozens of German prisoners, still wearing the gray coats and field caps they had surrendered in, sat huddled on hard benches. The war that had swallowed Europe now felt very far away. The air inside the car carried the scent of damp wool, pine smoke drifting through cracks in the boards, and the metallic chill of winter settling over the land. None of the men spoke at first. The silence was broken only by the occasional cough and the distant echo of the locomotive whistle announcing another mile passed in a country they knew almost nothing about. Oberleutnant Hans Becker sat near a frost-covered window, his breath forming clouds against the glass. He wiped a small circle clear with his glove and stared at the passing forest. It stretched forever, dense and dark, broken only by the glimmering white of snow-covered lakes. He had expected cold. He had expected captivity. He had not expected this vastness. The land seemed untouched, a world that had never heard artillery or seen the flash of a muzzle. It unnerved him more than he cared to admit. Beside him, Franz Adler shifted uncomfortably, tugging his coat tighter around his shoulders. "This country is empty," he muttered. "How can anyone live out here?" Hans kept his eyes on the window. "Maybe they don't. That might be the point." The guards moved quietly along the aisle. They were Canadian soldiers, many only a few years older than the prisoners themselves. Their uniforms were worn from winter service, but they carried themselves without hostility. One stopped near Hans's row and nodded politely. "Water?" the guard asked, holding out a tin cup and a small canteen. Franz blinked in confusion, as if the simple kindness was a trick. "You're offering it to us?" "That's right," the guard replied. "Long ride ahead. Don't want anyone passing out." Hans accepted the cup first. The water was cold and clean, tasting faintly of minerals. He passed it to Franz, who drank with cautious gulps. The guard waited until they were done and then moved on, offering the same to every man in the car. "Strange," Franz whispered. "They treat us like travelers." "Maybe they see us that way," Hans answered. "We are far from home." The train slowed as it neared a small settlement. The prisoners leaned toward the windows, eager for anything that resembled civilization. A few wooden buildings stood near the tracks, their roofs buried under heavy snow. Smoke curled from chimneys. A team of horses pulled a sleigh down the main street. Children in thick coats chased each other through the snowbanks, their laughter rising above the hum of the train as if unaware of the war swallowing the rest of the world. As the train rolled past, a little girl in red mittens waved at the boxcars. One of the prisoners waved back before realizing what he was doing. Franz shook his head in disbelief. "They don't look afraid of us," he said. Hans watched the girl disappearing behind the trees. Why should they? We're thousands of kilometers from the front. To them, we're just men being taken somewhere. A guard at the far end opened the sliding door to let in fresh air. The burst of cold stabbed into the car, and several prisoners groaned. But with the cold came the scent of spruce, clean and sharp. Hans inhaled deeply, surprised by how different it felt from the smoke-choked forests of Europe. The guard leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "We'll be stopping soon for a meal. Simple stuff, but warm. You'll stretch your legs a bit too." Franz looked at Hans with raised eyebrows. "A meal? Outside? They think we won't run?" "We're in the middle of nowhere," Hans said. "Where would we go?" When the train stopped on a cleared stretch near a frozen river, the prisoners were led out under close but calm supervision. Canadian soldiers had set up a small field kitchen, and steam rose from pots of stew. The cold bit instantly at the exposed skin of the German prisoners, but the food smelled like heaven. The guards handed out metal bowls and spoons, speaking softly and giving simple instructions. No shouting, no barking orders. Hans accepted his portion, the heat warming his hands through the metal. It tasted of potatoes, venison, and salt. He ate slowly, watching the river beyond the tree line. It was frozen solid, a gleaming sheet of ice stretching from bank to bank. Pines stood sentinel along the edges, their branches heavy with snow. "This land is too big," Franz said between mouthfuls. "You could walk for days and find nothing." "Or find everything," Hans countered. "Depends on what you're looking for." Another prisoner, Weber, overheard them. "I heard stories before we were captured. Canada is supposed to be full of empty forests and polite people. Looks like they were right about both." A few guards chuckled at the remark, though they pretended not to. One of them stepped closer, his breath forming white plumes. "Polite, sure," he said. "But don't think the officers won't notice if you try anything foolish. It's a long walk to civilization, and the wolves don't care what uniform you used to wear." Franz swallowed hard. "Wolves?" The guard grinned. "Plenty of them. Big ones." Hans wasn't sure if he believed him, but the chill that crawled up his spine was real. The wilderness was no cage made by men. It was something older, colder, and far more certain. When the prisoners were loaded back onto the train, the sun was sinking behind the tree line. Orange light spilled through the cracks in the car, illuminating faces lined with fatigue and uncertainty. As darkness settled, the train's lanterns cast a dim yellow glow over the interior. Some men dozed. Others whispered about their possible destination. Franz leaned closer to Hans. "Where do you think they're taking us? A camp near a city? A base?" Hans shook his head. "No, if they wanted us near a city, we would have seen one by now." The train rumbled through the night, deeper into the interior. Hans felt each mile pulling him farther from the world he knew, carrying him into a land shaped by snow, forests, and quiet strength. The guards remained calm, speaking gently as they checked on each group. It unsettled Hans more than cruelty would have. There was something disarming in kindness, something that made him feel unbalanced. Near midnight, the train slowed again. Lanterns swung as men stirred awake. Through the window, Hans saw tall wooden fences rising out of the darkness, illuminated by the moon. Beyond them were low buildings clustered around a central clearing. Smoke rose from chimneys, and figures moved between the shadows. "This must be it," Franz whispered. "Our new home." Hans didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the camp, not with dread, but with a strange, calm curiosity. The journey through the wilderness had softened something in him. Though he didn't yet know what, he felt a shift, subtle but undeniable, like the first crack in a frozen river. The guards opened the doors and motioned for the prisoners to climb down. The cold hit them instantly, sharper than before. The air smelled of pine, wood smoke, and untouched snow. It smelled like a different life. Hans stepped onto Canadian soil, hearing the gate creak open in front of him. He squared his shoulders, steadying himself. Whatever waited inside, it would not be anything like the war he had known. And as he walked through the gate, he sensed that the true journey was only beginning. Morning light spilled across the camp like a soft, golden veil, washing over the wooden barracks and casting long shadows on the snow-packed ground. When Hans Becker stepped out of the hut for the first time, he drew in a breath so cold it stung his lungs. Yet the air felt clean, almost invigorating. The camp was nothing like the grim prisoner pens he had imagined during the voyage across the Atlantic. There were fences, of course, and guard towers, but the place had a strange calmness about it. Smoke drifted lazily from the kitchen chimney. A Canadian sentry walked by, humming something that sounded suspiciously like a folk tune. Franz Adler emerged behind him, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "I dreamed of bread," he said. "Real bread. Not the stale stuff from the ship." "Maybe you'll get some here," Hans replied. "This country seems determined to surprise us." A bell rang near the center of the yard. The prisoners gathered instinctively, though no one shouted orders at them. Instead, a Canadian corporal walked up onto a small platform and raised his hand. "Breakfast is ready. File in by barracks. Take your time and don't push," he announced. His voice carried authority, but no harshness. "Afterward, you'll meet the camp staff and get an orientation. Nothing complicated." Franz stared at Hans with wide eyes. "Orientation? Are we employees now?" "If we are, I hope the pay is decent," Weber added, stepping into line with a grin. Inside the mess hall, long tables stood neatly arranged. Steam rolled off large metal containers filled with oatmeal, bread, and what looked like preserved fruit. A cook wearing an apron stained with flour handed out ladlefuls with a nod to each prisoner. The guards watched, but not with suspicion. Their posture felt more like hosts overseeing a large gathering. Hans took his tray and sat beside Franz. "This is better than rations we had in the Ardennes." Franz lifted a spoonful of hot oatmeal and let the warmth sink into his hands. "I feel like we've walked into the wrong camp." At the next table, a guard struck up a conversation with a group of prisoners. He spoke a mix of English and halting German, making everyone laugh when he butchered a phrase. "You boys come from Hamburg?" he asked one prisoner, a thin young man named Keller. Keller nodded. "Yes, my family lives near the port." The guard smiled. "Big place. I always wanted to see it one day. Maybe after the war." The easy tone unsettled some of the Germans. Kindness was not a language they expected from captors. Yet it flowed effortlessly here, carried along by the simple rhythm of daily life. After breakfast, the prisoners gathered in a large hut where a major with a trimmed mustache stood waiting. His demeanor was professional, but the warmth in his eyes was unmistakable. "I'm Major Robert Hawthorne, commanding officer of this facility," he began. "You're here as prisoners of war, but you'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention and then some. Canada takes that seriously." He paced slowly, hands behind his back. "You'll find this camp operates on respect. You behave, we behave. You work if you choose to, and you'll be paid in camp credits. Those can be used at the canteen for small comforts. We also run classes, sports, and other activities. You are our responsibility, not our enemies." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Even Hans felt his chest tighten with something close to disbelief. A prisoner raised his hand. "Major, why such generosity?" Hawthorne paused. "Because the war will end one day. And when it does, I'd rather you return home remembering that you were treated fairly. Maybe the world will be better for it." Franz leaned close to Hans. "I think I'm hallucinating." "No," Hans said. "This is real, and it's more disorienting than anything we've faced." The major dismissed them, and the camp gradually came to life. Some prisoners played cards by the barracks. Others gathered near a group of Canadians setting up a woodworking station. The guards felt less like sentinels and more like watchful neighbors. Later that morning, a guard named Ellis approached Hans and Franz as they inspected the camp perimeter. Ellis was tall, with a weathered face and a kindness in his eyes that felt genuine. "Settling in?" he asked. Hans nodded. "It's quiet here." "Too quiet for some," Ellis replied. You boys are lucky you came in winter. Summer brings mosquitoes bigger than bullets. Franz shivered. I'd rather face the cold. Smart choice, Ellis said, chuckling. Come on, I'm heading to the canteen. You can see what they offer. Inside the canteen, Hans saw shelves lined with soap, writing paper, shaving kits, and even chocolate. Chocolate. A luxury he hadn't tasted since before the Eastern Front. The prisoners wandered through with wide eyes, murmuring in amazement. Franz picked up a small bar. They let us buy this? Ellis answered, You earn credits from work. Snow shoveling, wood chopping, helping in the kitchen. Nothing forced. You choose. Hans turned the chocolate over in his hand, studying it like a relic. You trust us with tools?
Sure, Ellis replied. We've had prisoners here for years. Not a single serious incident. Most realize it's not worth ruining a good thing, eh?
Outside, a group of men were building snowshoes. Others played improvised hockey on a cleared patch of ice. Laughter echoed across the camp, light and surprising. After years of gunfire, bombs, and orders barked under threat of death, the sound felt foreign. In the afternoon, the prisoners attended their first roll call. The guards stood relaxed, rifles slung casually, eyes soft rather than hard. When Major Hawthorne walked through the ranks, he stopped beside a prisoner who was shivering violently. Cold? The major asked. The man nodded. Hawthorne gestured to a guard. Get him another coat and 2 pairs of socks. The guard saluted and hurried off. Franz whispered, Are we sure we were captured by the right country? Hans replied, I don't know what to make of this. It feels like a world that doesn't belong to war. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the pines and cast long blue shadows across the snow, the prisoners returned to the barracks. Inside, a stove glowed with steady heat. Someone had strung a makeshift line for drying socks. The smell of pine wood filled the air. Weber sat at a small table, writing a letter. They let you send these home, he said. Can you imagine? Real letters. They say the Red Cross forwards them. Hans sat on his bunk, listening to the crackling stove. What do you write? He asked. Something simple, Weber replied. That I'm alive. That the guards treat us well. That Canada is unlike anything I've ever seen. Hans lay back, staring at the ceiling. The camp was still a prison. The fences still stood tall, the towers still manned. But the feeling inside these walls was something he couldn't quite define. A strange blend of safety and uncertainty, hospitality and captivity, warmth and isolation. As the barracks lights dimmed, Franz whispered across the room, If this is how they treat prisoners, how do they treat their own people? Hans didn't answer. He closed his eyes and let the thoughts settle deep in his mind. This place was reshaping them, quietly, gently, one day at a time. And he sensed that tomorrow would bring a new kind of revelation, one tied to the immense land stretching far beyond the camp's fences. Winter had tightened its grip around the camp, but inside the barracks, the stove burned steadily, filling the air with dry warmth. Hans Becker woke before dawn, drawn from sleep by the muffled sound of boots crunching through snow. He sat up, rubbed his eyes, and noticed a faint line of pale blue creeping above the horizon. The cold outside seemed to seep through the walls, but the quiet beauty of the morning held him for a moment. Canada still felt foreign, but day by day it was becoming something else as well, something he couldn't yet name. Franz Adler groaned from the bunk across the room. Please tell me we aren't chopping wood again. No, Hans replied, swinging his legs over the side of his bed. Not today. We're assigned to the work detail near the river. Franz sat up, hair sticking in every direction. The river? Why in this cold? Hans shrugged. The guards didn't say. Maybe they want to drown us. Franz chuckled, still half asleep. At least it would be quick. The morning bell rang, and the prisoners filed out of the barracks. Their breaths rose in white clouds. A Canadian sergeant named McLean awaited them by the gate. He was a broad man with wind-reddened cheeks and the easy confidence of someone who had spent his life in the outdoors. "All right, boys," McLean said. "We're heading to the timber line. Gonna clear a path today. Should be simple work. Keep your gloves on, keep your spirits up, and keep an eye out for each other." As they moved through the gates, the forest unfolded before them. A wall of towering pines heavy with snow, their branches creaking softly in the still air. The path had been walked before, but new snow covered the old footprints. McLean and two other guards led the group, while the prisoners followed in a loose formation. The deeper they walked, the more the camp vanished behind them. Soon, they were swallowed by the forest's quiet, broken only by the distant caw of a raven and the rhythmic crunch of boots. Hans felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The war, the noise, the chaos of Europe, it all seemed impossibly distant. Weber, walking beside him, whispered, "If you had told me last year that I would be in the middle of Canada appreciating trees, I would have laughed in your face." Hans smiled faintly. "And yet, here you are." They reached the river just as the sun crested the treetops. The ice glittered like a sheet of glass. McLean turned to the men. "This is the sort of place that clears a man's mind," he said. "Canada will do that to you. Now, see that fallen pine near the bend? That's our job today. We'll cut it, saw it, and stack it for transport." Franz looked out at the river, awestruck. "It goes on forever." "Most things do out here," McLean replied. "That's why people either love it or never return." The men began their work. The Canadians handed out saws and axes without hesitation, though they kept their rifles slung over their shoulders. Trust was a delicate balance here, built one small gesture at a time. Hans gripped the saw with Weber, and together they began cutting through the thick trunk of a pine that had snapped in a storm. The work was exhausting, but strangely satisfying. The cold air sharpened their senses. Snowflakes drifted from the branches overhead, melting on their warm faces. The forest seemed alive, watching them, whispering its ancient stories through the wind. After an hour of labor, McLean called for a break. He handed out tin cups filled with hot tea that smelled faintly of spruce. The warmth spread through Hans's fingers like a gift. "You boys are doing good work," McLean said. "Some of you have a knack for this." Franz laughed. "We're learning to become Canadian lumberjacks." "What a career change." McLean grinned. Worse things to be. As they sipped their tea, a distant howl echoed across the woods. The prisoner stiffened. Weber's face paled. "Wolves," he whispered. He wasn't joking. McLean nodded calmly. "They won't bother you during the day. They're curious, that's all. This is their home as much as ours." The howl faded, but something about it lingered in Hans's chest. It reminded him that the world was not always shaped by men and their wars. There were places where nature remained sovereign, untouched and unbroken. The thought humbled him. After the break, the work continued. The fallen pine was cut into manageable sections, each piece heavy with sap and snow. Teams of men hauled the logs to a clearing where sleds waited. Occasionally, a gust of wind sent flurries into the air, sparkling like crushed diamonds in the sunlight. Hans paused at the riverbank, drawn by the icy beauty before him. He crouched, touched the frozen surface with his gloved hand, and felt the deep chill beneath. Franz walked up beside him.
"You all right?" Franz asked.
"Just thinking," Hans said. "In Europe, everything feels so small now, cramped, full of borders and front lines and old grudges." "And here?" Franz asked. Hans looked out across the frozen expanse. "Here it feels like you could walk for a lifetime and still have room left to discover." Franz nodded slowly. "Maybe that's why the guards are the way they are. When you live in a place like this, maybe hate doesn't find much space to grow." They returned to the group as the sun dipped lower. The day's work nearly finished, McLean inspected the stacks of timber with approval. "Good job today," he said. "You earned some rest. And maybe something extra." Back at the camp, the men found a surprise waiting for them. The cooks had prepared a stew richer than usual, filled with root vegetables and thick cuts of meat. The aroma spread through the barracks like a warm blanket. Guards mingled among the prisoners, chatting easily. Someone began playing an old accordion, and soon a few men hummed along. Hans ate slowly, savoring each bite. Across the table, Weber tapped his spoon thoughtfully. "I think this place is changing us," Weber said. "Not in a bad way, just changing." Franz nodded. "I used to wake up angry every day, angry at the war, at the enemy, at everything. But here, I don't know. The anger feels smaller." Hans leaned back against the wooden wall, listening to the soft creak of the barracks and the wind brushing past the windows. "This land shows you how big the world really is," he said. "Bigger than war. Bigger than us." When lights out came, the men settled into their bunks. The stove crackled softly, casting a warm glow across the room. Hans closed his eyes and let the silence wrap around him. For the first time since the war began, he felt something that had long been absent. It wasn't hope, not exactly. It was gentler than that. A quiet awareness that the world still held places of peace, places untouched by hatred and conflict. As he drifted into sleep, a final thought settled in his mind like a gentle snowfall. This wilderness, this strange and boundless land, had already begun to carve its mark on him. And even if he didn't yet understand how, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. When he returned home one day, he would never see the world the same way again. As the lights in the barracks go and the quiet settles over the Canadian wilderness, the story of these men begins to fade into the cold night, just as thousands of others once did. German POWs arrived in Canada expecting harshness, suspicion, and the familiar bitterness of war. Instead, they stepped into a world that did not mirror their anger. A world defined not by barbed wire, but by snow-covered forests, calm rivers, and guards who treated them with a dignity they had nearly forgotten. In the months that followed, many of these men would work along the timber lines, learn English from patient instructors, write letters home describing a captivity that felt impossibly humane, and discover a land whose silence held more power than any shouted order. Some would return to Germany and tell their families that the Canadians they met were unlike any enemy they had imagined. Others would come back years later, not as prisoners, but as immigrants, seeking the same vast peace they once found through a fence. The untouched wilderness shaped them in ways they could never fully explain. It softened the hard edges carved by years of propaganda. It reminded them that the world was larger than the trenches and cities they left behind. The kindness of strangers did the rest. In the middle of a war filled with cruelty, This corner of Canada became a place where humanity endured quietly and steadily. As our journey ends, imagine the last moments of a winter night in that distant camp. The guards finishing their rounds with slow, steady steps. The stove crackling as it keeps the cold at bay. The prisoners drifting to sleep, no longer thinking like enemies, but simply as men who survived another day. Above them, the northern sky spreads wide and endless. A reminder that even in the darkest years of human history, there were places where decency held firm. The war would move on, battles would be fought, and the world would change. But the memories carried by the men who lived here would never fade. They would remember Canada not as a prison, but as a turning point. A quiet pause in the violence, a vast land that showed them a different version of humanity. And so, as the snow settles once more on the pines and the camp recedes into the past, one truth lingers. In a world at war, sometimes the most powerful victory is not won on a battlefield, but in the simple choice to treat even an enemy with compassion. This is the legacy of the wilderness that changed their hearts.